Welcome to Bright Threads in the Tapestry, a series where I piece together the brightest threads from my favorite stories and analyze them to figure out what makes them shine. Today we'll look at 4 passages from Toll the Hounds, which is the 8th book of the Malazan Book of the Fallen series by Steven Erikson, and analyze them to understand the structure that they put together in the chapter. So every other chapter, for the most part, in Toll the Hounds, follows this sort of, I want to think of it as an accordion structure, where there is an introduction of sorts to the events of the chapter. It's a high-level overview of what's to come, and then there's a closing off of the events. There's a sort of a conclusion summary of sorts, but they also sort of put a different spin on the events than you might take away from just reading the events. They introduce it a certain way. Sometimes it's poetic, sometimes it's setting up a theme for the chapter, and then the conclusion also throws a slightly different light or some additional light to the events that occur in the chapters. These are the Darujistan chapters. I should have mentioned earlier, but these will be spoiler-filled for everything that happens up to and in Toll the Hounds. Though I don't think we'll be touching too much on spoilers. It'll probably be just discussing the events in these 2 chapters, but I might mention something that happens in the last 7 books or later on in this book perhaps, so just keep that in mind. Of course, I'm discussing the 8th book, so if you're watching this, I'm assuming you've read the Malazan Book of the Fallen or don't care too much for spoilers for the series. So this is an episode that I've been somewhat nervous to make. I have been nervous about filming the whole Bright Thread series in general, but this one I've been particularly nervous about because I have been reading the series for about 3 years, and I started my channel sometime last year, a YouTube channel called Reading by the Rainy Mountain, if you're listening to this on the podcast and aren't sure what I'm talking about. And my primary motivation for starting the channel was that I'd have a way to discuss the, I think, hundreds of highlights that I have for all the books in the series. I read these mostly on Kindle, and I highlight the heck out of them. I think every other page has a highlight because I like something a character says, or I like how something is worded, or some of the elements of the world that I find really interesting. So I have all of those highlights, and I was sort of reading them solo until last year. In fact, I still am. I haven't done any Malazan discussions with anyone, but that was my goal, to eventually find people to discuss the Malazan Book of the Fallen series with, and also, in the fullness of time, the Esselmont books as well. I haven't read any of those. I am planning to, when I finish the Book of the Fallen series. I've read 9 out of 10 of these. I have started, The Crippled God. I'm about 160 pages in, and I'm hoping to finish that sometime by the end of August, which is great because we have a reading group starting up sometime in the next few months to read the Book of the Fallen series from the beginning, and also maybe work in the Esselmont books as well as we make our way through. We're going to set a slow reading pace of potentially 100-ish pages a week. We'll see how that goes. We have to plan it amongst other group reads that we have going on. But anyway, I am going to soon have the opportunity to explore these books from the beginning and discuss them with a whole lot of people. But meanwhile, and possibly even after we start the discussion series, what I love doing is talking about the words on the page. I love discussing the high-level events with the discussion group, but also I think the long passages which, start at a place and then go where you don't expect it to, or when I'm left feeling elated or completely miserable at the end of a passage or chapter, I highlight those, and then I like to go back and look at what were the specific words or sentences that evoked those emotions in me. That's kind of the goal with this series. And there are hundreds of such passages in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, like I said. And I want to go over all of them. And this is something I've been wanting to do for near on 3 years now. So, I'm both super excited and highly nervous for this episode. But with all that said, I'm going to start simple. There are many different themes that I really resonated with in Toll the Hounds. If I had to pick my favorite or most important one, it's probably the discussions around redemption and the religion of the Redeemer that Anamander Rick has with Endesilan. I think those are the passages that mean the most to me from this book, and the connecting passages with the two other gods that we encounter in this book. However, I think I will need more time to prepare for those discussions. So we'll start simple with the Darujistan chapters, the sort of, like I mentioned, the accordion structure of theirs. So forgive me for this comparison, but I used to watch Grey's Anatomy for a while until, I watched a few seasons until it became way too much drama. But what I really liked about that show was each episode would start with a quote of some sort or a high-level summary, and then there'd be a bunch of action in the episode, and then there'd be a sort of like closing of events, and both of those were written in really good language. Another show that I thought did this really well was Heroes. I loved the opening sequences and the closing sequences where we had this narrator. I think the character who did the narration was usually Mohinder Suresh. It's been 15 years since I watched that show, but I remember his name because I loved those intros and exits to the episodes. And these chapters reminded me of that structure, and they are the intro and the end summary of these Darujistan chapters are really beautifully written, and I think it's Krupp narrating them, and he puts a spin on the events that maybe we wouldn't have thought of if we had just read the events as they happened. We get an additional narrative layer to what happens in the story as we read the introduction and the conclusions, or we are primed to think about them a certain way when we start the chapter. So I really loved those Darujistan chapters that had this intro and conclusion, and I feel like they were similar. If I remember correctly, there's about like 10-ish instances of these. I know it's every other chapter for a certain time. Like the very beginning chapters don't have it, and I think the ones in the end where all the action sort of blends together between Koral and Darujistan, those chapters don't have it, but every other Darujistan chapter does. And each time it serves a different purpose or tells the story a different way. It's really obvious in the first two that it's sort of summarizing the themes or the events of the chapter in the beginning and in the end. But later on, it's less obvious that, it is still pertaining to all the events, the themes that are mentioned in the beginning, but it's also slightly different. Each time it serves a different purpose or it does something differently. So I love how similar yet different each instance is. So I thought for today's discussion, we'll look at two sets of these intro and conclusion passages. Basically just generally admire them. That's my goal, I guess, with this discussion. I don't have any larger point to make than, oh, this is like really beautiful, and here's why I think so. So we'll do that, and then maybe look at the difference, the similarities and differences between the two sets of passages. And these are the ones, I picked the ones from chapter 3 and chapter 5 for discussion today. They were easy to do because I didn't have to read the chapters. Each chapter takes me about an hour and a half to read, and I absolutely did not have the time to do that for this week's discussion. But what I want to do eventually is take a look at one of the later chapters, and where it is slightly less obvious that the introduction pertains to everything that happens, or it's sort of a starting point for, or a trigger point for everything else that happens through the chapter, and not just a high-level one event summary. I'll maybe do that later on, but for today, we're looking at the introduction and conclusion passages of chapter 3 and chapter 5 of Toll the Hounds. All right, so here we go. The first passage is the introduction to chapter 3 from Toll the Hounds. On this morning, so fair and fresh with the warm breeze coming down off the lake, there were arrivals. Was a city a living thing? Did it possess eyes? Could its senses be lit awake by the touch of footsteps? Did Darujistan on that fine morning look in turn upon those who set their gazes upon it? Arrivals, grand and modest. Footsteps, less than a whisper, whilst others trembled to the very bones of the sleeping goddess. Were such things the beat of the city's heart? But no, cities did not possess eyes or any other senses. Cut stone and hardened plaster, wood beams and corniced facades, walled gardens and quiescent pools beneath trickling fountains, all was insensate to the weathering traffic of its denizens. A city could know no hunger, could not rise from sleep, nor even twist uneasy in its grave. Leave such things, then, to a short, rotund man seated at a table at the back of the Phoenix Inn, in the midst of an expansive breakfast, to pause with a mouth crammed full of pastry and spiced apple, to suddenly choke. Eyes bulging, face flushing scarlet, then launching a spray of pie across the table into the face of a regretfully hungover Mies, who, now wearing the very pie she had baked the day before, simply lifted her bleary gaze and settled a basilisk regard upon the hacking, wheezing man opposite her. If words were necessary, then she would have used them. The man coughed on, tears streaming from his eyes. Salty arrived with a cloth and began wiping, gently, the mess from a motionless, almost statuesque Mies. So I love everything about this passage. I love that it starts by asking such deep questions, waxes poetic about all the aspects of a city, and then moves on to this comic element of this rotund man seated at a table at the back of the Phoenix Inn, and then he spits out on Mies's face, poor Mies. And I love the switch from the extremely serious to extremely hilarious, but all the while the implication that someone or something momentous has arrived to the city. And we see here arrivals grand and modest, footsteps less than a whisper, while others tremble to the very bones of the sleeping goddess. What follows in this chapter is a whole series of arrivals. So I love that this sets up the theme for what's going to happen in the chapter. That's great. And then it's telling us grand and modest. Which ones does the city or this rodent man, namely Krupp, consider grand? Which ones does he consider modest? I suppose we know as readers, we can take a guess, but it also makes us think in that vein, right? Some of these arrivals are huge events for the city, others somewhat unremarkable. And we're going to be thinking about that as we read the chapter. It's not just, oh, a bunch of people arrived to Darujistan. It's, oh, which ones of these are significant for later, because that's how it's phrased in the introduction. And I also love how poetically this is phrased. Footsteps less than a whisper, whilst others trembled to the very bones of the sleeping goddess. And then this question here, did Darujistan on that fine morning look in turn upon those who set their gazes upon it? I love that characterization of the city as someone or something that can look back at the people who are entering or considering entering the city. That is just such a beautiful image there. And then these descriptions here of the city, the corniced facades, the walled gardens, the quiescent pools, they're all just building on that poetic elements of the previous chapter. And then we just switch with tones and get pretty funny that, and while it's funny that Krupp lost the pie from his mouth, it is, I think, also adding to the significance of the previous passages. Some people have arrived to the city, and one or more of them has made Krupp spit out his pie. He is worried about their arrival or is shocked by it. And here, if words were necessary, then she would have used them. It seems like Mies knows that something might be going on, and that's why she's keeping quiet, even though Krupp, she was somewhat, what's the word I'm looking for? Discomfited by Krupp's spitting pie on her face. And then it all concludes with salty wiping Mies's face. I think the first scene that this opens with afterwards, if I remember correctly, is the arrival of the Trigel Guild. But Krupp knows all about them. I don't know if they were I don't remember if they were on a mission from which they were not expected to come back just this moment. So even though it starts there, I don't think that's quite what made Krupp be shocked. I don't remember if that is the case, because like I said, I did not reread these chapters and I've read them more than 9 to 10 months ago. But I love how this sets us up for the arrivals and makes us think about more than just the fact of their arrival, and the added beauty and poetry to it. It's just brilliant. I love it. It's what Erikson does best, and it's beautiful. I would like to add that Krupp in conversation is somewhat annoying, I'll grant that, but I love the humor that stems from that. I know Krupp and Iskaral Past, at least from my stalking the Malazan forums, is a somewhat divisive character in that people either enjoy the humor with them or they don't. I fall on the side of bring on more Krupp and Iskaral Past. I think one of my favorite scenes in this book was when they run across each other. Maybe we'll do a bright thread for that one day. But yes, in conversation, Krupp can be annoying. I will grant that. However, I love his eloquence in these introduction and conclusion summaries. And it is frustrating when he does that in conversation, but when it's part of the book, when it's part of the story being told, it's brilliant. Now, on to the ending passage of chapter 3. I'll read it first and then we can talk about how this is a nice close parentheses for the beginning of the chapter. And so the denizens of Darujistan grew raucous, enough to give the city itself a kind of life. Headlong indeed, with nary a thought for the future, be that the next moment or a year hence. Gas hissed into blue flame. Acrobats and mummers whirled through crowds. 100,000 musical instruments waged war on the plains of song. And if it was said by some scholars that sound itself was undying, that it rode unending currents that struck no fatal shore, neither in space nor through time, then life itself could be measured by its cry. In the times of free blue clarity, and in the times of gathering clouds, in the chorus of pronouncements that sang out arrivals, worlds lived on, as immortal as a dream. On the rooftop of a bastion tower, on this night, there stood a woman all in black. Ice cold as a raptor's looked down upon the sprawl of rooftops, spark-lit chimneys in the distant slums of the Gadrobi district, and, drifting silent over all, this woman thought long and thought hard of the future. On a street close to Call's estate, a cloaked man paused, stood rooted like a stone whilst the fete swirled round him, and even as he concluded that a public return such as had first occurred to him might prove unwise, so walked another man, younger, but with the same look in his hardened eyes, on his way to the Phoenix Inn. Far in this one's wake, down at the quayside, a blacksmith, his half-wit servant, and a woman whose generous curves drew admiring glances from all sides, ambled their way towards the night markets of the Gadrobi, seeing all with the wonder and pleasure only foreigners could achieve when coming for the first time upon one of the greatest cities in the world. Closer to the ship from which they had disembarked, a high priest of shadows scurried for the nearest shadows, pursued mostly unseen by spiders drifting on the lake breeze, and on the trail of both scampered a score of Bokarala, many burdened with new offerings and whatever baubles they claimed as rightful possessions. A fang-bearing squall that flowed through crowds accompanied by shouts of surprise, terror, and curses, as their collection of possessions burgeoned with every pouch, purse, and jewel within reach of their clawed hands. Aboard the ship itself, the captain remained. Now she was wearing loose, flowing robes of black and crimson silks, her face white as moonlight as she frowned at the city before her. A scent on the air, some lingering perfume redolent with memories. Oh, of all places! But was this truly an accident? Spite did not believe in accidents. And so she hesitated, knowing what her first step on to solid stone would reveal. Perhaps, she decided, it would do to wait for a time. Not long, just long enough. In another part of Darujistan, a merchant of iron dispatched yet another message to the master of the Assassin's Guild, then retired to his secret library to pore once more over ancient, fraught literature. Whilst not too far away sat a merchant guard with fading, barbed tattoos, frowning down at a cup of spiced, hot wine in his huge, scarred hands, and from the next room came a child's laughter at this, and this sound made him wince. Down among the new estates of certain once criminal moneylenders who had since purchased respectability, a destitute towel gnome stealthily approached the high, spike-topped wall of one such estate. Debts, was it? Well, fine, easily solved. Had he lost any of his skills? Of course not. If anything, such talents had been honed by the rigors of a legendary journey across half the damned world. His glorious return to Darujistan still awaited him. Come the morning. Aye, come the morning. At this moment, in a small chamber above the taproom of the Phoenix Inn, a man was lying on his back on a bed, still weak from blood loss, and in his thoughts he walked the cemetery of his past, fingers brushing the tops of weathered tombstones and grave markers, seeing the knots of tangled grass climbing the sides of dusty urns, while stretching away in his wake was the shadow of his youth. Fainter, longer, fraying now at the very edges. He would not lift his hand yet to feel his own face, to feel the wrinkles and creases that wrote out in tired glyphs his age, his waning life. Oh, flesh could be healed, yes. Below, amidst a mob of bellowing, reeling drunks and screeching whores of both sexes, a small, round man, seated as ever at his private table, paused with his mouth stuffed full of honeyed bread, and, upon hearing the 10th bell sound through the city, cocked his head and settled his tiny, beady eyes upon the door to the Phoenix Inn. Arrivals. Glory and portent, delightful reunion and terrible imminence, winged this and winged that, and escapes and releases and pending clashes and nefarious demands for recompense over a single mouthful of spat wine. Such a night. Such a night. So this section, sort of, we can see it's fairly obvious that it reflects upon the same themes as the section at the beginning of the chapter. It's doing the obvious summarization of events, which is, the beginning of the chapter is people are arriving, and then many people arrive, and then now it's sort of summarizing the current state of all the people who have arrived to the city over the course of the day. But also, we can see it has some of the same themes as the introduction that it's wrapping up. I think in the beginning, we get a sense that big things are happening or are about to happen, while more mundane things continue to happen. Sorry. I think the juxtaposition there of the questions around, does the city turn its gaze upon those who look at it? I guess I'm paraphrasing. Sorry, I did a poor job. But, we move from there to the really mundane aspect of Krupp spitting on Mies, spitting out pie on Mies. And here, I think we're sort of building on that. We are seeing a lot of interleaving of really big, important things with small, seemingly inconsequential or insignificant aspects of daily life. For instance, I think this highlight here says it better than anything else in this passage. Gas hissed into blue flame. Acrobats and mummers whirled through crowds. 100,000 musical instruments waged war on the plains of song. And if it was said by some scholars that sound itself was undying, that it rode unending currents that struck no fatal shore, neither in space nor through time, then life itself could be measured by its cry. So we are starting with a fete and a bunch of musical instruments that are presumably not working well together because they are waging war on the plains of song. Waging war doesn't sound good, so I'm going to conclude from here that it means that the musical instruments are not working well together. They're just each is sort of being its own thing. But they're also sending those waves off into space and time. And this is one of the things that you can measure the existence of life with. So we started from such a seemingly mundane, even soundingly annoying thing to, thinking about the existence of life and how it can be measured. And then here, I think another one here is, right here actually. Headlong indeed, with nary a thought for the future, be that the next moment or a year hence. That's sort of reinforcing that something might happen. It's setting the reader to expect that big things are coming, but the people of Darujistan, lost in their celebration, are not really anticipating anything, or they are not inclined to really consider that at the moment. The other thing I love about what this passage does is it sort of, there's, sorry, I'm a software engineer, the engineering must come out, but there's parentheses within parentheses. So there are, two aspects of the same theme, I guess, that are brought out together. I'll tell you what I mean. I'm not explaining that very well, but here, in another part of Darujistan, a merchant of iron dispatched yet another message to the master of the Assassin's Guild. And in the same paragraph, we also read about a merchant guard with fading barbed tattoos. So there's a merchant of iron and a merchant guard with fading barbed tattoos. And I think the merchant and here the two cloaked men who both of them for different reasons are entering the city quietly. On a street close to Call's estate, a cloaked man paused, stood rooted like a stone whilst the fete swirled round him, and even as he concluded that a public return such as had first occurred to him might prove unwise, so walked another man, younger but with the same look in his hardened eyes, on his way to the Phoenix Inn. So both of these people are headed towards Phoenix Inn. They are cloaked, it seems like, similarly, and they have the same hardened look in their eyes. And I guess they are also, I think this is referring to Qatar and Reliknam. Different reasons, but same destination and same look in their eyes. So it's like, I love these sort of inner parentheticals within this passage that is also telling us, sort of summarizing two things that are similar, noting the similarities between those events, while also drawing a higher level picture of all the arrivals in the city. It's grouping the things that might point to similar events or are headed in the similar direction. I think this one, the Master of Assassin's Guild and, the Merchant of Iron and the Merchant Guard, I guess these are referring to Humble Measure and Gruntle. We know that their paths collide somewhat later on in the book. For instance, I don't remember if Gruntle actually encounters Humble Measure. I don't think he does. But we know that the boy being referred to here, Harlow, is going to be affected by Humble Measure's schemes or the mines that he owns, I think. So this was, in retrospect, a really nice passage to read as well. And then I love some of the sheer poetry in this. I already talked about the opening passage about it was said by some scholars that sound itself was undying. I love that passage. I love how it starts with 100,000 musical instruments waged war on the plains of song. That is all extremely poetic. And then here, just before the conclusion, we have a call. I think this is not call, sorry, Murillo. I think it's Murillo. Thinking back and reflecting upon his life. And here, to feel the wrinkles and creases that wrote out in tired glyphs his age, his waning life. And in the conclusion, it's really sad and melancholic. Oh, flesh could be healed. Yes. It's something so poetic about, when something reads not as positive as it is written. Yeah, flesh can be healed, but that's not what we're talking about, right? I think he has a lot of past mental or emotional hurts that possibly are difficult to heal. And and then this section here that tells us about, I don't remember exactly who this is referring to, but I remember being mystified by it at the time I read it. I think now that it's possibly Lady Envy. On the rooftop of a bastion tower on this night, there stood a woman all in black. ice cold as a raptor's, looked down upon the sprawl of rooftops, sparklit chimneys in the distant slums of the Gadrobi district, and drifting silent over all, this woman thought long and hard of the future. So this, along with, I guess, spite, is potentially reflecting upon the fact that envy is in the city. I think that's what's going on here, but I'm not sure. But that's the other thing that I love about writing or concluding chapters in this way, is that there is still some puzzling out to do. I have finished reading the book. I've read this chapter. I remember at a high level what happens in it. I recollected most of it by sort of flipping the pages and looking at a passage here and there. But I still am unsure about what some of these events refer to. So they give you so much to think about when you come back to them, even when, it's been, 3 months since I finished the book. And I still have so much that I still need to figure out. When I reread, I'll probably still have some things that I'll wonder about. Does it mean this or does it mean that? And then it could maybe, for all I know, mean both things. So yeah, I really love how there are these internal correlated events that are summarized here, while also summarizing at a high level what's to come. And the other thing that I thought it does really well is, yes, it is a summary for what happened in the chapter. We started with, this is going to happen, many things happen, and then we're summarizing, okay, here's where everyone is, a lot has happened, here's where everyone is. But we're also looking forward. We have a forward moving dynamic here, because we're also looking at more things that are to come. For instance, Spite is going to enter the city at some point. She hasn't entered the city yet. She's still on the ship. And we can anticipate that she is... and so she hesitated, knowing what her first step onto solid stone would reveal. Perhaps she decided it would do to wait for a time. Not long, just long enough. So I love that there's things to anticipate. Like, again, the fact that Humble Measure is sending off another contract to the Master of the Assassin's Guild. We know there was some high action from a failed assassination attempt on the bridge burners in the previous chapters. So there's more setup for action to come in the future chapters. And also Grantil and the Kid. That's, we know, coming chapter 5, which we will also look at the intro and summaries of. There, the kid we meet there, Harlow, I don't remember if we met him in this chapter, probably not. But it's coming. We know that there is a lot of setup for action to come. So there's a lot of interesting intrigue here that makes me want to find out what's happening in the next chapter. I was going to say keep reading, but each of these chapters takes me an hour and a half to read. So I'm usually satisfied with just one chapter at a time. But yes, it makes me want to pick up the book again, and it plants all these seeds and of questions that I want answered. So it's doing the summary of the previous chapter, but also setting the stage for more events to come. And I think that's fantastic, along with, of course, the absolutely beautiful poetic language used here. On to the next chapter. Darujistan, glories unending. Who could call a single deed inconsequential? This scurrying youth with his arms full of vegetables, the shouts from the stall in his wake, the gauging eye of a guard 30 paces away, assessing the poor likelihood of catching the urchin. Insignificant? Nonsense. Hungry mouths fed, glowing pride, some fewer coins for the hawker perhaps, but it seemed all Prophet did was fill a drunken husband's tankard anyway, so the bastard could die of thirst for all she cared. A guard's congenitally flawed heart beat on, not yet pushed to bursting by hard pursuit through the crowded market, and so he lives a few weeks longer, enough to complete his full 20-year service and so guarantee his wife and children a pension. And of course, the one last kiss was yet to come, the kiss that whispered volumes of devotion and all the rest. The pot thrower in the hut behind the shop, hands and forearms slick with clay, dreaming, yes, of the years in which a life took shape, when each press of a fingertip sent a deep track across a once smooth surface, changing the future, reshaping the past. And was this not as much chance as design? For all that intent could score a path, that the ripples sent up and down and outward could be surmised by decades of experience, was the outcome ever truly predictable? Oh, of course she wasn't thinking any such thing. An ache in her left wrist obliterated all thoughts beyond the persistent ache itself, and what it might portend, and what herbs she would need to brew to ease her discomfort. And how could such concerns be inconsequential? What of the child sitting staring into the doleful eye of a yoked ox outside Cobb's womanly charms, where her mother was inside, and had been for near a bell now, though, of course, mother had Uncle Duroth, who was a secret, for company, which was better than an ox that did nothing but moan? The giant, soft, dark, so dark, brown eye stared back, and to think in both directions was obvious. But what was the ox thinking, except that the yoke was heavy, and the cart even heavier, and it'd be nice to lie down, and what could the child be thinking about but beef stew? And so no little philosopher was born, although in years to come, why, she'd have her own uncle who was a secret, and thus, like her mother, enjoy all the fruits of marriage with few of the niggling pits. And what of the sun high overhead, bursting with joyous light to bathe the wondrous city like a benediction of all things consequential? Great is the need, so sudden, so pressing, to reach up, close fingers about the fiery orb, to drag it back, and back into night and its sprawled darkness, where all manner of things of import have trembled the heavens and the very roots of the earth, or nearly so. Back, then, the short round man demands, for this is his telling, his knowing, his cry of witness, echoing still and still. The night of arrivals, the deeds of the arrived, even as the night arrives. Let nothing of consequence be forgot. Let nothing of inconsequence be deemed so, and who now could even imagine such things to exist, recalling with wise nod the urchin thief, the hawker, the guard, the thrower of pots, and the child, and the ox, and Uncle Duroth with his face between the legs of another man's wife, all to come, excuse, in the day ahead. Mark, too, this teller of the tale, with his sage wink. We are in the midst. So I mentioned at the beginning that I thought that these introduction and outroduction, conclusion parentheticals for each chapter, that they were very similar in nature, but yet are so different, because they're, of course, laying the ground for the events to come in the chapter. But I think it's obvious even in just these two examples that we're looking at. The first one, the theme was centered around how large, important things are coming, but most people in the city are unaware and are sort of focusing on their own internal lives. And the narrator or the storyteller, Krupp, is okay with that. He says, yeah, that's expected. But now he's telling us about these seemingly inconsequential things, and is demanding that we listen, that nothing is without consequence, that we witness all the events that sort of snowball into each other, I think we find out in the course of the chapter. And so that was this theme of large events happening while in the distance. I think that sort of, this passage here is sort of extending that theme a little bit, but now we're stepping back and looking at the smaller inconsequential things that might snowball into the bigger events later in the book. It also occurs to me that these passages are sort of Malazan Book of the Fallen in miniature to a certain extent. So there is some philosophizing from the point of view of some of the characters. For instance, the pot thrower, who is contemplating the shaping of her life as she's shaping the pot. We are, of course, told that she's actually not thinking any such thing. Her hand's aching, and that's all she can focus on. But, if you think about it as Malazan in miniature, we have a lot of characters who are, sort of have these deep philosophical thoughts as they go about their seemingly unimportant daily activities. So this pot thrower is thinking of the years in which a life took shape, when each press of a fingertip sent a deep track across a once smooth surface, changing the future, reshaping the past. And was this not as much chance as design? So I think, and then the follow-up of that the ripples sent up and down and outward could be surmised by decades of experience. Was the outcome ever truly predictable? I love I love that. Like, she's contemplating the fact that she could have been thinking about this, not actually thinking, we are told. How does Krupp know that? I don't know. But a lot of the characters in Malazan, we know, are, as they go about their life, they stop and have these deep thoughts. While we're on that subject, I love the particular deep thought that this potter has. Or pot thrower, I don't know if that's the same thing. And she's basically thinking about how you can do your best to shape life as you want, but many things still turn out to be unpredictable. I think I love that thought and how it is phrased here, which I think is Krupp's style. It's also Malazan in miniature because this passage is vastly different from the previous one. A little bit, well, I don't want to say vastly, but it's pretty different from the previous one in style or the things it asks us to focus on, while also being pretty similar to it. And then, and then there's a whole host of characters which feel inconsequential, but we see later on that they build up to become important. Anyway, moving on from that subject. The other thing that I loved about this opening was this particular comment here about the sun, that we are dragging the sun back, wheeling it back and saying, no, we'll not start there. We'll start the night before and talk about what happened then. And I love that Krupp sort of says, this is my tale. I will tell it how I want. And I'm asking you to witness this, so you must. That again, I think, is a sort of Malazan in miniature to a certain extent. Malazan Book of the Fallen in miniature, I guess. I haven't read Esselmon's Malazan book, so I don't know that I can say for both. And then I think some of these people become important characters later on, or it turns out are important characters for later on. I think the pot thrower is Torvald Nom's wife, if I remember correctly. The child is Harlow. He has a big arc later on in the story. Not this child, the urchin, the thieving urchin. The woman, the hawker, who is stolen from. I think is she the person who has the serial killer husband? I don't remember, but I think she also turned out to be someone important. And the guard, I think, also is the one who stalks the serial killer husband. I could be wrong about those. I don't remember enough, sorry, to say one way or the other. But if I remember correctly, I think those are the characters. So some of these people have like these huge arcs later on in the story, but the others, like the child looking at the doleful eye of the yoked ox, she doesn't come back. I think all we know about them is this conversation between the two members involved in that relationship her mother's having with Uncle Duroth, who was a secret, that Torvald now overhears as he goes to steal from his debt collector. And yeah, so there's a lot of very important people, and there are some people who we just meet briefly because they influence something some of the other characters are doing. So I love this sort of call out by the teller of the tale. Let nothing of consequence be forgot. Let nothing of inconsequence be deemed so. And who now could even imagine such things to exist, recalling with wise nod the urchin thief, the hawker, the guard, the thrower of pots, and the child and the ox, and Uncle Duroth with his face between the legs of another woman's wife. I love this call to let nothing of inconsequence be deemed so, because we might not know of it, but they all impact the people that we do want to read about or do want to follow in ways that we may not fully be aware of. So yeah. So like I said, yeah, I love how similar to the previous opening passage this is, and yet how different, and how it's playing on a different theme, how its style is slightly different. We have the same poetic aspects of the writing here as we did in the first, or the telling of the tale. I guess this is Krupp's style of narrating. So there is that aspect of poetry, but we've sort of switched away from thinking about those large, big questions like, does Darujistan turn back and gaze at those who are looking at it? And instead, we are looking at an ox, a pot thrower, and a child, and we're still asking those same deep questions, like in the case of the pot thrower, but in a very different way. So yeah, I love that it did that. So we'll move on now to the final passage, which is the closing parentheses, if you will, of this chapter. Glory is unending this night in Darujistan, and now the dawn stirs awake, a light to sweep aside the blue glow of the unsleeping city. See the revelers stumbling towards their beds, or the beds of newfound friends, or even a stranger's bed. What matter the provenance of love? What matter the tangled threads of friendship so stretched and knotted? What matter the burdens of life when the sun blazes into the sky and the gulls stir from their posts in the bay, when crabs scuttle for deep and dark waters? Not every path is well trod, dearest friends. Not every path is set out with even pavestones and unambiguous signs. Rest eyes in the manner of a thief who is a thief no longer, as he looks with deepest compassion down upon the sleeping face of an old friend. There in a small room on the upper floor of the Phoenix Inn, and sees too a noble councilman snoring slouched in yon chair, while in the very next room sits an assassin who is, perhaps, an assassin no longer, dull-eyed with pain as he ponders all manner of things, in fashions sure to be mysterious and startling, were any able to peek into his dark mind. Elsewhere, a child long ago abandoned by his mother frets in his sleep, pursued by a nightmare face with the absurd name of Snell attached to it. And 2 guards run, hearts pounding, from the gate to the estate, as alarms ring loud and urgent, for an evil man has lost all his ill-won wealth, a fact as sure to pluck his talents as a torturer's pliers, since evil only thrives in a well of power, and when the coin of cruelty is stolen away, why, so too vanishes the power. A fingerless man stumbles home, God-blessed and blood oozing from battered knuckles, while his wife sleeps without dreams, her expression so peaceful, even the most unsentimental sculptor could do naught but weep. And in a street unworthy of any particular notice stands an ox, thinking about breakfast. What else is there, after all, when love and friendship and power and regret and loss and reunion, fierce enough to tear away all that might have been bittersweet, when all, All is gone and done with. What else is there but the needs of the stomach? Eat, dine on pleasures, and taste sweet life. Inconsequential? Bah! As Krupp ever says, it is a wise ox that gets the yoke. So this passage is very similar to the conclusion of chapter 3. It's summarizing, well, it's not so much summarizing the events as telling us where everyone is at the end of the action of the chapter, I think, and putting a nice additional layer of thought into all the events. For instance, this line, what matter the provenance of love? What matter the tangled threads of friendship so stretched and knotted? So, yeah, a bunch of revelers are going back home with newfound friends and partners, but what matter the provenance of love? I love that additional layer of thinking that we add to the events there. And we extend that on to what matter the burdens of life, and there's more philosophy here, I guess, that, adds a sort of poetic layer here. We're talking about gulls and crabs. And then I think here, again, we're doing the same thing that we did at the end of the last chapter, where we read about Cutter and Reliknom in the same paragraph, I think, if I remember correctly. And here we're doing the same thing. Cutter, in the manner of a thief, who is a thief no longer, is looking at an old friend with compassion. And I think Cutter is now an assassin. And the assassin, who is no longer an assassin, is dull-eyed with pain as he ponders all manner of things. So in the previous section, we put them both together, I think, because what ends up happening, I think, if I remember correctly, is Cutter stabs Reliknom, and now he's injured. So anyway, the fact that we read about them together there, and now we're reading about them together here. Oh yeah, that's right. We read about them together in the previous conclusion of the chapter. And now we are reading about them here too. And this one, it's slightly different from the previous one in that we're not setting up a lot for future action. It's mostly just sort of concluding the events of the day, which is interesting. And then there's this interesting conclusion that when it all boils down to nothing, what else is there but the needs of the stomach? So we're back to the mundane. We soar up to the beautiful and eloquent, and then we come crawling back down to the mundane aspects of daily life, which is, I guess, in some ways what this chapter is about very inconsequential, mundane things, but that still matter a lot to larger events, to its big events, to the people undergoing them. I think this is great and beautiful commentary on life, but also I love the organizational structure. I think of it as accordion. I think I mentioned the small opening, the expansion out into great detail about all the things we mentioned briefly, and then the closing, quieting summary towards the end. So that was today's Bright Thread. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you again next week with a Bright Thread from the Fiona Tapestry by Guy Gabriel Kay. See you in the next one. Bye.